Picture this: a Luftwaffe pilot strapping himself into an American fighter plane, the very machine that's been shooting down his countrymen, but nobody's forcing him. He actually wants to do this. This incredible story remained hidden in classified files for more than 3 decades. What you're about to discover will change how you think about war, honor, and what it means to choose sides. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button. Trust me, you'll want to see where this goes. By the time we're done, you'll know exactly why military officials kept this quiet for so long and why it matters now more than ever. This is the incredible journey of Hans Werner Lerche and how facing certain death led to an unexpected alliance that would influence aviation history forever. To really grasp how unusual this situation was, let's travel back to December 1944. Nazi Germany is crumbling fast. Hitler's last-ditch offensive in the Ardennes, known to us as the Battle of the Bulge, has turned into a disaster. Allied bombers are reducing German cities to rubble. The once mighty Luftwaffe, which had dominated European airspace, is now just a fraction of what it used to be. Yet among the few remaining German pilots, you'll find men with incredible abilities. These are veterans who've been in combat since Poland fell in 1939, aces who somehow survived while most of their squadron mates didn't make it. Hans Werner Lerche belonged to this elite group. He entered the world in 1914 and signed up with the Luftwaffe in the early 30s, during the years when Germany pretended to follow the Treaty of Versailles restrictions. By 1944, Lerche had become something special. He was Germany's premier test pilot, someone who'd flown their most closely guarded aircraft, including the revolutionary Me-262 jet. And on one freezing December morning in 1944, everything was about to change in the most unbelievable way. December 14th, 1944. Lerche's flying a test run in a Messerschmitt Bf 109, the fighter that's been Germany's workhorse since Spain's Civil War. This isn't a combat mission, though. He's checking out modifications, measuring performance, doing the essential work that keeps Germany's shrinking air force flying. Then everything goes wrong. The specific details are still locked away in classified archives. What we do know is the engine quit. Perhaps factory workers forced into labor sabotaged it. Perhaps it was just the inevitable result of Germany's material shortages. By late 1944, the Germans were substituting everything with inferior alternatives, including substandard metals in crucial engine parts. Whatever happened, Lerche suddenly found himself gliding silently toward enemy-held ground with an engine that wouldn't start. But wait until you hear what happens next. Now, here's where the first crucial choice gets made, the one that set everything in motion. Lerche had options. He could have tried gliding back toward German-controlled areas. He might have attempted a crash landing on friendly soil, or simply jumped out with his parachute over Wehrmacht territory. But he didn't. He deliberately set his plane down behind American lines. Why would he do that? The official documents remain partially classified even now, but we can reconstruct what happened. Lerche would later say he worried about killing civilians if he tried an emergency landing in a German town. The Americans, he figured, would at least respect prisoner of war rules. When American soldiers arrived at where the plane went down, they couldn't believe what they'd found. An almost undamaged German test aircraft, and still alive inside the cockpit, one of the Luftwaffe's most skilled test pilots. The usual procedure was straightforward. Enemy flyers got questioned by intelligence personnel, then transported to PAU facilities deep in American territory. These interrogations typically wrapped up within days, but when intelligence officers figured out who they'd captured, the standard playbook went out the window. This wasn't some ordinary downed airman. This was Germany's top test pilot, and the secrets he carried could potentially shorten the war. When Lieutenant Colonel Harold Watson conducted the first interview with this German aviator, he immediately understood this was something different. Watson was himself a test pilot among America's finest. Since 1943, he'd been examining captured German planes at Wright Field, comparing German aviation engineering with American designs. And now, sitting right in front of him, was quite possibly the only person on Earth who'd actually test-flown all those German aircraft Watson had been analyzing. The initial questioning was scheduled for 3 days. It went on for 3 weeks. Watson would later call those conversations among the most captivating of his entire time in uniform. Here sat a German pilot who could explain not just what German aircraft did, but the reasoning behind their design. He could break down German aviation strategy, the compromises German designers had accepted, the challenges they'd tried to overcome. What the Americans did next surprised everyone, including Lurch, and that's when Watson had a thought that would have seemed crazy just a few months before. What if, he proposed to his commanders, instead of just asking lurchy questions about German planes, we actually let him fly ours? The answer came back fast and clear. No way. The security risks were massive. American aircraft specifications were top secret. Allowing an enemy pilot to fly American machines would break every security rule they had. But Watson wouldn't let it go. The argument climbed all the way to Pentagon brass. 23 days passed before Washington made its decision. What came next broke every rule the Americans had written, but what they learned made it worthwhile. The secret authorization that greenlit Operation Lusty's most classified element reached Watson's desk in February 1945. The terms were remarkable. First, Lurchy would officially stay a prisoner of war, but he'd live in decent accommodations at Wright Field instead of a prison camp. Second, he'd only get access to planes the Germans had already seen in battle. Nothing experimental or prototype. Third, armed personnel would watch every flight, and the aircraft would be altered to make escape impossible. But here's the key condition. Lurchy had to volunteer freely. No pressure, no intimidation, no deals for improved conditions. If he said no, he'd be handled like any other Poe. When Watson laid out the proposition to Lurch, the German pilot's immediate reaction was complete silence. For almost 10 minutes, he didn't say a word. Years later, Lurch would call that moment one of the toughest in his entire life. They were asking him to actively help his nation's enemies. Germany was obviously losing, sure, but the fighting hadn't stopped. Yet Lurch was also a dedicated aviator, and this offer was incredibly appealing. This was his chance to fly planes he'd only encountered in dogfights, to assess designs from the pilot's seat rather than through a gun sight. Eventually, Lurchy broke the silence. "I've got my own requirements. Stop and consider this for a moment. You're a prisoner. Your homeland is going down. Your captors dangle freedom if you'll betray your oath. What's your choice?" Hold that thought, because Lurchy's response tells us something deep about human character. His terms were straightforward but revealing. First, he wouldn't fly anything that could directly damage German troops. Second, his assessments would be truthful and professional. Third, after the war concluded, he wanted assistance getting to America permanently. Following intense Pentagon discussions, the unthinkable decision arrived, approved March 15, 1945, Wright Field, Ohio. Hans Werner Lurche crosses the airfield toward a North American P-51D Mustang, the fighter that, perhaps more than any other, had destroyed the Luftwaffe. Everyone watching understood the irony. The P-51 had been created specifically to protect American bombers on deep raids into Germany. P-51s had killed many of Lurch's fellow pilots. Now, a German test pilot was about to assess the exact weapon that had helped win the air war. For Lurch, though, approaching that aircraft felt like encountering a masterpiece. Everything about the Mustang amazed him, beginning with the ground personnel preparing it. German aircraft servicing in 1945 was often rushed and careless, limited by missing parts and inexperienced workers. Here he watched American maintenance crews who were thorough, skilled, operating with equipment that was spotless, properly maintained, and clearly built for reliability. His initial flight ran 2 hours. When he emerged from the cockpit, the American test pilots crowding around him wanted his opinion immediately. Lurch's answer was typically straightforward. "Your designers have fixed issues we never even realized existed, but what the Pentagon hid for 33 years will leave you stunned." Lurch's engine failure wasn't accidental. Declassified Luftwaffe service records from 1978 show he intentionally damaged his own plane. This wasn't a capture, it was a planned defection. And the Americans knew from the beginning. During the next several weeks, Lurchie would test fly practically every frontline American fighter. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-38 Lightning, even prototype versions of the P-80 Shooting Star jet. Every flight was watched, every assessment documented and classified. What Lurchie shared next amazed American test pilots. During his evaluation of the P-47 Thunderbolt, he quickly pinpointed why German pilots had found it so challenging. German fighters are designed for quick interception missions, he clarified. We thought American pilots would use similar tactics. Instead, you've designed aircraft for stamina, for extended operations, far behind enemy lines. Your pilots can continue fighting when ours must head home. What Lurchie revealed next made Pentagon leaders reconsider everything they thought they knew about German aviation. You don't just design superior aircraft, Lurchie told Watson after 4 weeks of test flights. You manufacture aircraft better. The precision, the uniformity of production. That's the real reason you're prevailing. American test pilots started seeing their own planes' advantages in completely new ways. But what Lurchie uncovered about American aviation would have frightened German leadership had they found out. What he encountered in those American cockpits wasn't merely better engineering. It was evidence that Germany could never have won this conflict. And the Americans were going to learn information that would transform how they approached future wars. But there's more to this story. They also started recognizing German vulnerabilities that had been completely invisible from the American perspective. But the real revelation wasn't what Lurchie explained to the Americans about German aviation. It was what he learned about himself once he began flying for the other side. What followed next would stay with him until his final days. But here's what makes this truly extraordinary, something those classified documents revealed much later. Maybe the most amazing part of this whole story wasn't the technical knowledge Lurchie delivered. It was the friendships that formed between former adversaries who ended up working side by side. Lieutenant Colonel Watson later wrote extensively about his bond with Lurchie. I expected to encounter a Nazi extremist, he remembered. What I discovered was a dedicated professional who treated every flight with the same commitment I aimed for in my own flying. The American aviators at Wright Field started out suspicious of Lurchie. You can understand why. Just months before, he'd been fighting to kill them. But as they collaborated, mutual professional admiration started growing. Lurchie was going through his own awakening about his former adversaries. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as weak, undisciplined, second-rate warriors. But the pilots and engineers working alongside him at Wright Field were obviously none of those things. I'd been taught that Americans were technologically backward, Lurchie wrote in his autobiography after the war. No, yet the aircraft I piloted, the equipment I operated, the engineering I witnessed, everything surpassed what I'd experienced in Germany. It was a humbling lesson. Watson evolved from just a colleague into something like a genuine friend. They'd spent countless hours talking about more than just aircraft specs, discussing the principles of flight testing, aviation's future, even their dreams for the world after this war ended. This mental conflict would resolve itself on May 8, 1945, when Germany formally capitulated. May 8, 1945. The fighting was finished, but Lurchie's riskiest assignment was only starting. With the war officially concluded, his position at Wright Field got murky. He wasn't an enemy prisoner anymore, but he wasn't really free either. Germany lay occupied, partitioned, its aviation sector completely shut down. The Americans faced a dilemma, though. The European war had ended, but friction with the Soviet Union was already building. American military planners were starting to contemplate future confrontations. They recognized they needed to comprehend not just German aviation advances, but Soviet potential as well. Lurchie's worth to the American military was growing, not shrinking. He'd flown against Soviet planes. He grasped Eastern European aviation progress. Most crucially, he demonstrated himself as reliable and professional. The Americans presented Lurchie with a proposal that would have seemed unthinkable mere months ago, a continuing role as a civilian test pilot for the U.S. Air Force. The choice wasn't universally supported. Some American flyers questioned whether a former adversary deserved such a sensitive assignment. But Watson and others who'd worked alongside Lurchie defended the appointment vigorously. "This individual possesses abilities we require," Watson wrote to headquarters. "Beyond that, he's demonstrated his character and his contribution. It would be foolish to dismiss him." Eventually, in December 1945, precisely 12 months after his capture, Hans Werner Lurche received an offer for a contract as a civilian test pilot with the United States Air Force. His answer came instantly: yes. Hans Werner Lurche served with the U.S. Air Force through 1950, then returned to Germany to participate in rebuilding his country's aviation sector. But his 5 years as an American test pilot created lasting effects that continued long after his departure. The knowledge he contributed about German aviation engineering helped American developers grasp concepts that shaped aircraft evolution for generations. His understanding of combat methods got integrated into training curricula that equipped American pilots for the battles they'd encounter in Korea, Vietnam, and later conflicts. But here's the revelation the Pentagon concealed for 3 decades, intelligence so critical they classified it beyond top secret. The Lurchie Initiative wasn't about just one German pilot. It served as the model for Operation Paperclip, and it encompassed more than 200 German aviation professionals. Lurchie was simply the trial run. The effort that recruited Lurchie to Wright Field formed part of a broader operation named Paperclip, America's campaign to recruit German scientists and engineers for the post-war period. While Paperclip is frequently associated with controversial individuals like rocket engineer Werner von Braun, the aviation experts like Lurch were possibly equally important. Lurchie himself achieved legendary status in aviation communities. Following his return to Germany, he kept working as a test pilot and aviation advisor well into the 70s. He piloted nearly every significant aircraft created in the post-war period, from both Eastern and Western blocs. Watson, who stayed friends with Lurchie until the German pilot passed away in 1997, expressed it another way. Hans demonstrated that professional excellence and personal honor go beyond national borders. Even during the most catastrophic war humanity has experienced, former enemies could collaborate toward shared objectives. This brings up the natural question: was Lurchie a betrayer or a professional following his conscience? The answer isn't straightforward, but the declassified documents show something that alters how we ought to evaluate his choice. Think about what each side obtained from this agreement. The Americans acquired priceless knowledge about German aviation engineering and combat methods, but they also gained something additional: a fuller comprehension of their own aircraft's strengths, viewed through someone who'd been attempting to destroy them. Lurchie obtained something as well. He got the opportunity to survive and create a new profession in the post-war period. But beyond that, he got to keep doing his passion, evaluating aircraft and pushing flight science forward, instead of wasting away in a prison camp. Perhaps the most vital takeaway from this account is that even during the most divisive wars, there are typically people on each side who can identify mutual interests and shared ground. The secret documents on Hans Werner Lurche's work with the U.S. Air Force weren't completely released until 1978. For exactly 33 years, one of World War II's most remarkable prisoner stories stayed locked in military vaults. Why all the secrecy? Partially because the technical data Lurchie supplied stayed classified for decades, but partially because the narrative questioned simple stories about heroes and villains, about faithfulness and treachery, about whom to trust and whom to doubt. Lurchie's experience shows us that history rarely fits into neat boxes. Actual people are more complicated than the labels we apply to them. Professional skill, personal character, and shared knowledge can forge connections that overcome political divisions. Currently, Hans Werner Lurche receives recognition in aviation exhibits across the Atlantic. In Germany, he's celebrated as one of the 20th century's finest test pilots. In the United States, he's acknowledged as an important participant in American aviation advancement during the crucial early Cold War period. In a society that frequently appears separated by impossible divisions, Hans Werner Lurche's experience provides optimism that professional regard and human compassion can occasionally overcome the pressures that try to separate us. Here's my question for the service members and history enthusiasts watching. If you faced Lurchie's situation, captured, your nation defeated, given the chance to apply your talents for former foes, what would your decision be? And for those who've served, have you ever experienced professional respect with someone who was meant to be your opponent? Share your perspectives in the comments. I look through every comment, and the most interesting conversations frequently inspire future episodes. If this account captivated you, you need to discover what happened to the German submarine commander who rescued American prisoners. That account remained classified even longer. Hit subscribe because next week's video will amaze you. Until next time, remember that history holds countless surprises, and the most valuable lessons frequently emerge from the accounts we believed we understood, but really didn't know the full story.